Jordan, how did the Soviet Union enter World War II? We will still be talking about that because we're going to talk about...
Because Russia attacked them.
Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. Taisha, leaders were of the Soviet Union. Who were the leaders of the Soviet Union, Italy, and Germany? We're going to talk about that too. And then Amber, how did the U.S. enter World War II, and why not earlier? Okay, so these are things we're going to answer questions to. We'll take it one step at a time. But before that, I want to go and I'm going to give you a PowerPoint. Okay, now this is a fun picture, and it doesn't really give you a lot of information, but I'll explain it using my own picture. Okay. So, for whatever reason, and it's just to let you know, it's very weird, but for whatever reason, the last couple of years, we actually have people that say they want to be socialists. And so you have heard the term socialist. And this is fairly rare because in the United States it's not very popular for national folks to ever mention socialism because it kind of goes against the whole fabric of American society. So the question is, well, what does it mean? And how is it different from what the United States has? Now typically people will say, well, you have socialism and then you have capitalism. But that's not accurate. Capitalism is kind of a form of our system, but it's not exactly what our system is. Okay? What our system is called is free market. And this is an economic system. And free market is based off of this idea that in the United States, you guys have heard, and I told you over and over again, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Have you guys ever figured out what pursuit of happiness means? I mean, doesn't that kind of sound silly? Pursuit of happiness. Now, we understand life, liberty. We can't be killed arbitrarily by the government. We can't be thrown in jail arbitrarily by the government. But what does it mean to have pursuit of happiness? Close. It does. It really does. But it's actually, it's so much more simple than it sounds. The pursuit of happiness. Your own dream. Whatever you want to do. It is a synonym for freedom. Okay? Freedom. Liberty. It's what the mission of our country, the United States, is based on. Now, this is Western Civ, but it's very, very important. Because we talked about why the U.S. did not enter into World War I. And part of this is that this old American idea is very ideological. The United States is very ideological. Remember? What's the opposite of ideological?
It's in my head.
Starts with a P.
Pragmatic.
Pragmatic. Okay. Pragmatic is basically you do what needs to be done, right? Regardless of wrong or right. It doesn't have any concept of wrong or right. And the United States has always been concerned about wrong or right. And this is ironic because today, the same people that are kind of talking about socialism are based on this concept of wrong and right. And so both of these concepts are actually ideological in theory. In other words, it sounds ideological. Now, not necessarily in practice. In practice, we're going to talk about this. In practice, socialism is very, very pragmatic. But in theory, it sounds very, very ideological, very idealistic. And that's kind of why sometimes Americans, like today, will bring up this term. Unfortunately, and I have to be brutally honest, and you guys you're aware of this. Unfortunately, because of social media. We have a very wide expanse of people that feel like they're somehow educated because they're talking with people all the time. And yet, they're really grossly ignorant. And I don't mean that as an insult, I mean that as an actual description. You guys understand what ignorant means. It means not knowledge. You don't have the knowledge. You can be a good guy, innocent guy, and ignorant means you just aren't trained in it. And so we have a whole bunch of folks that think that they know, but they don't. And so we start having conversations and discussions, and there's no facts in it. And part of the reason why socialism becomes something that's kind of attractive is that it is ideological, and it actually very strongly reflects this strong American heritage, this identity, the things to do the right thing, right? Equality, liberty, we want everybody to be free. It's connected to this. But the problem is that we don't quite understand what the word actually means. So if I were to say socialism, what does it mean? You guys give me a guess. And I think we talked about this a little bit, so maybe you remember, but maybe not. So we'll start.
Socially active.
That's what some people think, right?
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with that. But it's a very reasonable conclusion, right? Because you're socially active, right? You care. Socialists that care about things. But what would be a technical definition?
Pretty sure we wrote down the definition.
Yeah, well, let me just contrast it. So the free market society is based on the idea that you pursue your own happiness. And so it assumes the role of private property. This sounds silly, but the truth is, go ahead.
Wouldn't it be
Government.
like what China was, where they had, like, everything belongs to the government, and then you get
Yes.
certain things distributed to you, and only certain,
Yes.
like, certain people had a certain amount of things.
No private property, government ownership of means of production. And this is a complicated term, but it's actually super easy. Means of production, the things that make things. In plain language, factories, right? The means of production. So the government ownership of the means of production. No private property. And the government owns means of production. The reason why that these are contrary is that the pursuit of happiness assumes that you choose what you want to do as a job. You have the freedom to choose what you want to do as a job. And then they pay you. And there's an assumption that if they pay you, you should be able to keep what you earn. And so then you can accumulate property as a kind of an incentive. In fact, the whole free market concept is based off of these ideas of what we call supply and demand. We've talked about this before. If you have a high supply of something, then the price is not very high. Air, we don't charge for air because it's everywhere, right? Water, for the most part. If you have a low supply, very minimal, like gold or diamonds, then their value is super high. Similarly, demand. If you have a high supply, a low supply of something and nobody wants it, like the fungus under your toes might be very minimal. It's only your fungus. It's very rare, right? You can say, hey, rare. Nobody wants it. Low demand. You can't give it away, thankfully. So supply and demand. And this concept of supply and demand means that people will produce basically what they want. If they want something, somebody out there will make it. If they don't want it, then you'll stop making it and you'll make something else. This is sometimes referred to also as the invisible hand. And this term used to be very popularly understood. In other words, most people understood the concept of the invisible hand. You don't have to tell Bob, who wants to sell his toenail clippings for $500, you don't have to tell Bob that no one's going to buy his toenail clippings. Okay? He understands there's no demand for this. No demand. And so I'll go into some other type of business. Maybe I'll make something that's cute that people like. High demand. And since I'm making it and it's just me, it's also kind of rare. Supply is low. That's how I'll make money, right? If I make these, so many of them, that everybody's got one, even though they're cute and people like them, they may get bored with them. And so the supply will be very high, and the demand will start to go down, and so I won't get any money anymore. I'll move into some other business or some other type of activity. It's an invisible hand. They don't have to tell Bob to do this. People aren't buying it. He changes. This is kind of what the free market. Now, free market always presupposes democracy of some sort because it's based off of freedom. In fact, they go hand in hand. You don't need to know this too much because this is mostly what happened before the United States, but we are Western civs, so you do remember way back when we were talking about the Middle Ages, they had some free market, but mostly not. If you remember, in the Middle Ages, people were living in the castles, right? The peasants were there because they needed the protection. There's no money exchanging. There's not a lot of freedom. They're not slaves. They're not slaves. The peasants are there voluntarily. But whatever they make is part of the castle. The guy who's the lord of the castle promises to protect them, but then he also gets whatever is made. And so they don't get paid. But on the other hand, you don't have to pay rent either. It's part of being there. This is the old-fashioned style of the economy. Free market begins to emerge slowly. Remember, it's feudalism, and then the next step is this absolutism, where the king starts saying, I'm going to be the guy who restores order, so all the lords have to give me a little bit of money because we're going to pay for the standing army. The lords then start having to charge their peasants, so not just a portion, but they have to charge the peasants money, and so we shift into this different economy. And it's against this absolutism that we see the rise of constitutionalism. In England was the first one. Why should we give you money if you're not protecting our rights? And so there should be some freedoms. We should be able to be a business. We should be able to buy and sell without having to give the king all of this stuff. And in fact, if the king doesn't protect our rights, what are we going to do? We're going to alter the government. Either kill him like they did with Charles II, or tell, like James II, go away because you are not protecting our rights. That was a glorious revolution. And in the United States, that was 100 years later, we said, this is what we hold our governments to be true. All people are endowed with their creator certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Governments cannot take those rights away unless you've forfeited them. If you start murdering other people, you have forfeited your life, right? But if you don't do those things, then these are your natural, inalienable rights. And so because of this, this free market it's tied to democracy. Well, socialism is an ideological idea that argues that there should be no private property. Government should own the means of production. And what that means then is that government regulates most things. Well, little itty-bitty things. So let's say it's in our interest. We don't want to pollute the environment, so we're going to say no straws. It sounds like a silly thing, right? No straws. The government, and you might say, well, it's justification because if we have straws, it'll get plastic and we'll fill up the landfills and all sorts of things. So let's all agree no straws. Well, what have you done when you say no straws? You have taken away a freedom, right? The more regulation you have, the less freedom. So if you say no private property, that means then that your goods aren't really yours. It's not based off of the idea that all men are endowed with the creator of certain inalienable rights. It's actually, and you don't want to be concerned about it, but it's more of a Hobbesian idea. And this argument basically supposes that the government owns all rights. And then they give them out as needed. So when you say socialist economy, often we say things, and you guys hear this. This is one of the reasons why the socialist word has popped up. So someone will say, hey, we're going to give you free college. How many of you guys want free college? Absolutely, I want free college, right? Well, what does that actually mean? Is college ever actually free?
Like,
Someone's got to pay me, right?
your tuition would be free, but you'd like pay for like supplies.
No, free college will give you everything. But is it really free?
No, because you're gonna have higher taxes to pay the professors.
There's no such thing as free. Because I have to be paid, the lights have to be paid, the electricity has to be paid, all this stuff has to be paid, the new toys have to be paid. So nothing is free. So if we say free college, what are we really saying?
Higher taxes for.
We're saying there's no private property.
And other people will pay for your.
Other people. We call it redistribution of wealth. And redistribution of wealth means that you don't actually have private property. Now this can sound very flowery, especially on social media, but people will actually say this. Well, people have too much money. Those people have too much money. What that means is that you don't actually have a right to that amount of money. Because your rights are given out to the government, and somehow the government allowed that person to have that much money. How is that possible? He shouldn't have that much money. It's based off a presumption that you don't actually have a right to your property. So there are folks that come up with socialist idea that come up with an argument that if you make more than $100,000, then every penny more should go to the government. Because then the government would use that to pay for education or whatever. Because you don't have right, and the government then owns this. It's a totally different idea from what the United States is based on. Now most people don't think about that. They say free government, they think the government has all the money in the world, so free education, of course I want free education. Free healthcare, of course I want free healthcare. But there's no such thing as something that's free. It means somebody else has to pay for it. Now, there are two different arguments here. But the argument on this side is that this invisible hand, this provides what we call a natural incentive for productivity. What does that mean, productivity? In a plain language, it means there's a natural incentive to work. If someone says, I'm going to give you $100 an hour, you're going to work, get $100 an hour. If someone says, you could possibly get a couple of $100 just for being you, you don't really have to do anything, then what are you going to do? Nothing, right? There's no incentive to work because you can get it for free. So this concept, the reason why people object to this is that there's no incentive for work. There is an incentive, and this is very important. There is a natural incentive for government jobs. Why would that be the case?
Because if you were part of the government, then you're part of what owns it.
The money is going to the government. It's a natural incentive, right? But there's no incentive for work. These are clearly different views. Now, there are folks, and if you look at this, because it is an ideological argument, this is an ideological argument saying, you know what? You shouldn't have to work. You shouldn't have to. You should just be able to just live and just do whatever you want to do. So why do you need to worry about paying for school? Why do you need to be worried about paying for health care? Why do you have to worry about paying for anything? You should just be able to do what you want to do. And that's okay, except then you guys are smart enough to realize that there's no private property, and if there's no incentive to work, then how is the government eventually going to get that money? Because it's got it. You can't not pay for things. And so this is where, as a practical matter, socialist countries tend to be very poor. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news. Anybody hear about Venezuela, the word Venezuela? What is that all about?
So there's two people in charge. I can't think of their names, but
Okay,
one.
Maduro is one, and
Yeah.
Guy
So
Lion is the other.
they both have different ideas, and they've been relying on oil,
Okay,
and now there's less of it, I believe.
okay,
So since there's less oil, there's less
okay.
income or whatever.
Um,
There's like a civil war or something like that.
Okay,
Like a
very
riot going on.
interesting. It does have the largest oil reserves. This is bigger than Saudi Arabia, right? So, Venezuela was wealthiest nation in southern hemisphere, certainly in South America. So that's what it was. And then the guy named Maduro is a socialist.
And there's like a
It's not because the oil reserves have declined, the oil reserves have been untouched. It's because of the socialism. Now Venezuela is now the poorest nation in South America. Not in the southern hemisphere, because there are a lot of other poor nations, but it is the poorest in South America. People are actually starving. The parents are having to decide, I'll have food on this day, and my other parent will have food on the other day, so that we can make sure the kids have food every day. Because what happened is there's a scarcity of food because there was no incentive to grow. Socialized everything. So it just utterly destroyed the businesses. So as a result, and this is kind of a natural reaction, the new guy, and I can't remember how to spell his name, so I'm going to say something like Guyana or something. I don't know what the name is. It doesn't matter. He won an election. But Maduro refused to step down. And so the result is civil war. Now, this is not the first time we've seen this. It happens over and over and over again. Socialism has never worked. Socialism has never worked in actual practice. Now, I'm going to give you one more definition. The reason why I'm setting this up is not a modern political commentary. It really isn't. You have to understand these concepts to understand what's going to happen between World War I and World War II. You understand that? That's what this is all about.
I remember when after World War I, Germany got poor.
Yes. But what we're really going to look at eventually is the Soviet Union. So what is the difference
Didn't they have a civil war?
between, yes.
Like right after World War I, there was like a civil war. And then
We'll talk about that. Yes.
I think it falls in.
During World War.
Or yeah.
What's the difference between socialism and communism?
Communism, I think isn't like the president is in charge of everything.
Everything versus
Yes.
some, like mostly.
Okay, it's very close. You guys aren't too bad, but remember this is what we call a spectrum, right? What is a spectrum?
Not a dead.
Yeah, so there's kind of like a graduation between one side to the other, extreme one, extreme the other. So we know socialism and communism both have the same idea. No private property, and the government should own the means of production. The difference here is that socialism is under democracy, and communism is under a dictatorship. Now, the reason why this is a spectrum is that if your democracy gets to be very, very highly regulated, if government begins to regulate everything, then what happens?
Then it turns into
Then it turns into a dictatorship. Does that make sense? Because that's the goal, is it? So it's a spectrum. So if we look here at this big spectrum below, we can say no government regulation and all government regulation. And if we look have something called libertarianism. And libertarianism is a theory, but it's not practical. So someone explain what that means. 'Cause just looking at this spectrum, what does that mean to be a libertarian? Looking at what we zero government regulation whatsoever. And some people think, oh, that's capitalism. No, no. True libertarian means no government. And this, I say, is a theory because it assumes that the invisible hand is so strong that people will just be able to get along with each other, because if they don't, they'll have natural consequences. The problem, the reason why this is a theory, is that frankly, it denies human nature. Right? And what are some of the things of human nature? How about greed? How about anger? How about revenge? Sometimes I'm willing to actually lose a ton just to be mean to that guy because he upset me one time. So the idea that the invisible hand will take care of society never works. So what we call this, because it's not practical, we give this a term called utopian. And this refers to a book a long time ago, and I think I mentioned it to you guys, the guy Thomas More. This is right around the time that the modern nation states are rising. Thomas More was actually killed by Henry VIII. When Henry VIII said, I want to have a divorce, Thomas More was like the equivalent of like the prime minister. And Thomas More, a very strong Catholic, says, you can't just do that. You can't just steal all the church's land. You can't, you're not able to do this. And Henry VIII said, well, sure I am. And then he kills Thomas More. So there he is able to do it. It caused a great deal of unhappiness, and eventually this is what begins the path to the constitutionalism. It takes about 100 years. But he wrote a book called Utopia, where it's really kind of a satire. It's what a perfect society would be like. And what's very funny is that this perfect society is nothing like society under Henry VIII. So what does that tell you about Henry VIII? He's like the opposite of a good society. So we use the word utopia to describe a society that's perfect on paper, but not real. That's what the word utopia means. It's perfect on paper, but it denies actual human nature. It's not realistic. I'm mentioning that because on this other side is also utopian. Because it assumes that you can have all total government reaction, which means that there is no violations. The government controls everything. And so in this idea, this is called communism, right? And under communism, the theory is everybody owns, all own, all work, and so there is no need for government because we are all government. All are government. Now that sounds really fun, right? But what's the reality? Why?
Because people have different views of what should.
And some people are kind of natural leaders. Some people want that power. And so you don't have any possibility of no government. And just because everybody shares equally, does that mean that they all are happy to share equally? No, it denies human nature. It denies the reality of human nature. Now, I won't get into this, except that both of these sides are atheist. These are modern Enlightenment ideas that come up with a human ideal of how to solve things. So utopian societies tend to be atheistic societies because it means that God has no role in life, which means that our human nature doesn't actually involve a soul or right or wrong. You're just talking about, if everything is just economic, it's just about having access to goods. So these are the extremes. In between these extremes, then we have something called the free market, And then we have something over here, which is, I'm going to use this word, revolutionary communism, because it's a little bit different from utopian communism. Okay? And then in between these two guys, we have something called a welfare state. I don't know if you've heard that term before. And on this side, we have called socialism. What is a welfare state? Pretty much. That's right. Okay. So least government regulation, some government regulation, more government regulation, and then here most government regulation. And you can see it's a spectrum. So when you get to total government regulation, it's not very realistic. And I'll just give you an example. If you have a government that pretends to be total regulation, in other words, I'm going to set the prices on everything, the government's going to determine this, the government's going to own everything, you don't actually have any real property, what do you think actually happens?
Everybody's just making regulations anyway.
Yeah, it's called a black market. What is a black market?
Basically, anything
Anything that's not
Illegal.
regulated.
Yeah, it's illegal. And the funny thing here is that on this side, you actually have what's called a black government. This has nothing to do with color. It just means a shadow. In fact, that's what actually is more accurate, because you will actually know that term a little bit better. It's called the shadow government. What is a shadow government?
They're there, but they're not actually there.
Very good. So people do not recognize it, but they're actually arranging things. And so that's why they're both utopian, because that's what pops up. Now, where's the United States here? We are closer, probably around here. And that's where a lot of the debate. So this is an American history class, but clearly you have politician type folks that are pushing to go this direction, and you have politician folks that are pushing to go the other direction, right? We're not actually a socialist society. In fact, there are very few socialist democracies. People make example of, say, like Norway or Denmark, because they have socialized medicine. But Norway and Denmark are not socialist because their businesses are mostly unregulated. It's just that they put high taxes and they'll pay for certain types of things, but they won't own the government. You still have a free market. So the only examples where we have socialism are examples that have moved this way. Venezuela is an example. So we're also going to see other countries that are example. Germany will be an example between the wars. Okay? So you start off as a socialist society, which means it's democratic, but it doesn't take very long for it to become a dictatorship. Maduro is elected as a socialist. He completely takes over parts of the government, and then when he is elected out, voted out, what does he do? He stays in power, right? Because he moved from being a democracy to being a dictatorship. And that is most often what happens. The reason why I need to make this clear is that this is what we're going to see in those years between World War I and World War II. And especially in times when you have economic recessions, bad economies, there's a strong kind of a draw, a magnetism to socialism. Because if you're poor, what do you want? Things to be free, right? It makes sense, right? I want this free stuff. But what happens with that? There is another really big example that we saw in your class here. Anyone know what I'm talking about?
like the taxes and that.
How about France? Remember I mentioned there are two stages of the revolution?
Yeah.
The first revolution was really democratic. The second revolution really turned into something that was trying to be so more socialistic. And what did it lead to? The reign of terror. And irony of all irony, who gets it? appointed emperor within, say, 5 years? Napoleon, right? So it's a very easy transition. Now, this is background. This is understanding our vocabulary and understanding what it means. And unfortunately, when I mention our modern society, we use lots of these terms and we rarely know what they actually mean, right? But you guys will know what they mean. So when I use them, you won't be confused. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So we're going to shift here. And that's basically what this picture is, but we're going to ignore the picture. And we're going to ignore that picture. And we're going to totally ignore that picture. This is just a way of showing the picture that I had. Anarchy, tyranny, ignore it. Okay, so this is what we need to. You mentioned that civil war fell into, Russia fell into a civil war at the end of World War. It did. Part of the reason why it fell into a civil war is that the Tsar Nicholas was a dictator. He was not part of this constitutionalism. He wasn't also either part of the industrialization. So even though Russia remembers itself as having defeated Napoleon, it didn't. You guys know that it didn't. It was mainly the weather. It was mainly the fact that it was so far away. That's what defeated Napoleon. But Russia has on its mind that it's this very big, powerful country. And because it's a dictatorship, the Tsar short for Caesar, right? The Tsar says, we're going to get into this war. So they're fighting this war on the side of England. The problem is that they are losing horribly. Russia doesn't have modern technology. Russia doesn't have modern generals. They have horrible weapons. And more importantly, because the Tsar is a dictatorship, he's not very good at bringing up leaders. So he thinks that he's as a general. He sends people in and they die. And so there's this huge disruption within Russia. And Russia does something very similar to what France did. In March of 1917, keep in mind, the war is going to end at the end of 18. In March of 1917, the Russians have a revolution, and they overthrow the Tsar. But they have the same kind of revolution that France had. They don't kill the Tsar. They don't create a dictatorship. They don't have riots or whatnot. They really just simply remove him from office. And they set up a democratic government. The problem is that Russia has had no history of democracy. They didn't go through all the stages that we saw in France or England or any of that stuff. So their democratic government just is constantly fighting with each other. I don't mean physically, I mean verbally. So they remain in the war on the side of England and by this time the United States. But it's a constant kind of conflict. And Russia is still losing terribly. By the end of 1917, Russia has a second revolution. The communists overthrow the government. Now this is 6 months later. Do the communists overthrow the Tsar? No, the Tsar has already been overthrown. He was overthrown the first time in March. So this is 6 months later, in November. The communists overthrow the democratic government. And they overthrow the democratic government because they promise the people that they're going to give them free food and that they'll give them out of the war. And as soon as they take over power, early 1918, they surrender to Germany. Early 1918. Why is this oddly in black humor, dark humor? Why is this kind of funny? That they surrender to Germany in the beginning of 1918.
Because doesn't
Germany loses 6 months later. So you are surrendering to the losing side. But why did they do this? Because Russia was losing and there was lots of disorder and the communists promised, well, let me rephrase this. The communists are not a democracy. They overthrew a democracy, so they promised that they'll give free food and they'll get rid of the war, but they also brought in their own weapons, and they actually had a violent revolution, very much like the terror. And so from that point on, for 4 years, from 1918 to 1922, Soviet revolution begins. And this is basically a civil war. The war itself is done. World War I is done. Soviet Union loses, even though they were on the winning side all the way up until about 6 months. But they couldn't stand it for the last 6 months, and so they're having a revolution. So they lose on both fronts. They lose to the loser. When the war is over, they get nothing in return. Plus, they're in their own civil war. And it's between not just the czarists, but really Democrats, people that want to have a democratic government versus those that want to have a communist government. And in the end, and so we call them, it's between the Reds versus the Whites. And the Whites were the Royalists, but they're also the Democrats, and the Reds were the Communists. Okay? And this war fought for 4 years. The reason why the Reds won is that the Red Army took over most of these cities. And the Whites were taking over the rural area. By the way, this has nothing to do with race. All of Russia is the same race. It has to do with just how they describe themselves. Remember, in Les Miserables, red, the color of this, white, the color of this. It's all very symbolic, right? So the Red Army is representing the blood of the martyrs. It represents the communists. They had the cities. And because they had the cities, they also had supplies. Kind of like what's going on with Napoleon. The White Army had the vast areas of the rural, but they didn't have the supplies. And so over time, the White Army is just simply going to lose. And they did lose. Okay? But it takes 4 years. When this is done, a guy named Lenin takes over. He was the one who was in charge of the communists even during the war, even before the war. So Lenin is very famous among communists because this represents the very first communist success. What I mean by that is that they had a revolution and they won.
But okay, so didn't they change a city after him?
Oh, Leningrad, right?
Yeah, and then they changed it to
Petersburg.
Stalingrad.
Right, and then it became Stalingrad, right? Because that's the guy who came out later.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to get too much into Soviet history, but Lenin dies, and then there's kind of a conflict between the communists, and in the end, Stalin takes over. And we mentioned this. Stalin is responsible for the deaths of about 20 million people. Mainly because when he became leader, under the socialism, they took this area of the Ukraine, this part of the Soviet Union, and they eliminated all private property. What that meant is that they took away the farms of all the farmers. They told the farmers, this is now your government farm, I want you to continue to work there. Give us all the grain, and then we're going to take the grain and give it to the cities. And they never gave any of it back. And so this alone is responsible for about 6.5, 7, 8 million deaths where they died from starvation. It was a horrible problem. This, and combined with the fact that Stalin was also a dictator, so he used to round up people, arrest them if they ever opposed him, and because he would say, you are opposing the revolution, you're opposing the state. So he would arrest them secretly, so no one saw this. They would take them into this secret compound, beat them almost to death, beat them to the point where this guy would do whatever they were going to do. He would take them back, put them on the radio, and they would read a script of a trial. So it would seem like they're being democratic and they're having a trial. And this guy would admit to trying to poison the wells, trying to hurt all the people, to hurt the revolution. He was an enemy of the state. And after he made all these admissions, then they would take him out back and shoot him. And this was happening all the time. And the reason why it's even especially pernicious is it didn't matter what you did. you didn't actually have to do anything against Stalin. Sometimes it was just random. Why is that such a big, horrible thing? Everybody's living in fear, so you don't even accidentally say anything. And so what it brought up is something called the cult of personality. And what that meant is that people started saying wonderful, glorious things about how much they love Stalin. And why would they do that? Because they don't get accidentally, oh, you didn't say you love Stalin well enough. Maybe you're secretly an enemy of the people. He did this randomly. The guy who was his second in charge, he had the guy second in charge, his wife, arrested in the middle of the night. She wasn't murdered. She was just tortured and then sent off to the Far East to work in a work camp. And it was basically the lesson was, nobody is safe. This is a strong dictatorship that used communism as an excuse to basically be a little bit like what James I wanted to be, an absolute monarch. But we're not a monarch, we're pretending that we're a utopian society. Very violent.
So isn't that kind of like North Korea right now?
It is exactly like North Korea. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit later at the end of World War II, but we're going to see the same person. The other person who's even, because Hitler, you remember Hitler, we haven't gotten to him, but he's responsible for about 10 million deaths. And the reason why we remember Hitler so strong is that he killed about 10 million in the death camps between 1942 and 1945. So he was very systematic. 3 years he killed about 10 million. Well, Stalin killed twice as many, but he did it over the course of about 1931 to 1953 when he died. So he had about 20 years to kill the 20 million. The other person who's even the greater murderer of the 20th century is a guy named Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong, in what was called the Great Leap Forward, also forced all the farmers to change their practices because the government owned everything. So he forced everybody to change their practices, and as a result, there was mass starvation, and that resulted in about 30 million deaths. So Mao Zedong is responsible for about 30 million. Now this, again, happens between 1949 and 1975. So again, he's got even longer time, about 25 years where he's in office. There's lots of horrible communist leaders that are responsible. Pol Pot is a guy who is in Cambodia, and in the span of about 1 year, in 1977 to 78, he kills 1 million people that were opposed to him. Just rounded them up, killed them. There's a movie called The Killing Fields where he would put the bodies in these fields, and you go through it, and it's just literally mountains of skeletons because they just rotted out in the open. Pol Pot. All of these guys are communists. And if you go back to that diagram, it's you can say that everyone is equal and everyone shares, but it always goes into a dictatorship. And we're going to see that very specifically. Now, I'm giving you the conclusion. Now I need to give you how this happens. And we've only got about 6 minutes, but you can follow me. We're going to talk about the three main leaders. Not all of these are communists, but some of them are socialist. So what does Nazi mean?
Well, it's what Germany became.
This, by the way, is Lenin. When I told you Lenin, this is V.I. Lenin. Okay. This is Karl Marx. He's a German, right? But he was living in England. So he was talking about socialism as an ideology. Lenin is the one that actually put it into practice and then became the dictatorship. So I'm sorry, Jordan, what were you going to say?
Oh, like you said Nazi, and I was like, oh, that's what Germany.
Okay, Nazi, that's the Soviet Civil War. So one of the things that follows, of course, is that you're killing all of the opponents, and this is part of that revolution. So they're just murdering folks. National Socialism. Let's see if I get. Okay, that's money, by the way. National Socialism. That's what Nazi stands for. National Socialism. And if you take the first words, now it's in German, but that's basically what the argument was. National Socialists. And so the Socialists was the promise that Germany will take care of basic necessities. So the government will own certain means of production, but they'll still be private property. So this is very important. The war, World War I, wages from 1914 to 1918. And the winners of World War I are England and the U.S., and France, and a couple of others. We'll put Japan and Italy. Right? But they're a little bit different because they're on the opposite side, so they're not actually in Europe. Okay? The losers of the war would be the Soviet Union, because Russia becomes the Soviet Union. They changed their name. Soviet is another word for communist, kind of like the committee, like a commune. So the Soviet Union, their official name was the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So they said, we're all democracies, we're a union of democracies. One of the ironies is that because socialism talks about equality, they always call themselves democracy. And there was a time during most of the 20th century that if the government had democracy in its name, you almost always knew that it was a dictatorship. This is what is the Republic of Korea, the North Korea. Republic of North Korea says it's a democracy, Republic is a democracy, it's a dictatorship. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the Republic of Vietnam. They always define that because they said that we are a true democracy because we make sure that everyone owns and everyone works. But it's actually, it's a dictatorship. So we have World War I, 1914 to 1918. So the winners here have a problem. Part of the problem is that they blame Germany. Germany is a loser, Austria is a loser, the Ottoman Empire is a loser. There's all sorts of things that happen. I don't want to get too much into it, but Ottoman Empire becomes Turkey, and that's what we have today. Austria-Hungarian Empire just simply becomes Austria, okay, and then we have Hungary. So we have a breakup of a lot of these countries. Germany is Germany, Poland, and Soviet Union is a new country. It's Russia, they just give it a different name. All of these guys lost, and in the same time, even though Italy was technically on our side, if you remember, Italy was late in the war. So Italy also loses because they weren't part of the effort. They just came in at the last moment. That didn't help them. So these guys are all basically the losers. It will explain why this matters. All I'll say is that they are convinced that rule by might would have changed their government. And I'll explain this next week. We don't have, next Thursday, Wednesday, we don't have enough time to say it now, but I'll explain it. After World War I, between 1920 and 1930, all these guys had a booming economy. The Roaring 20s. The United States didn't accept the Treaty of Versailles because they didn't think it was equitable, but they are trading with everybody else. The economy is thriving. The British economy is thriving. French, everybody else is thriving. But in the rest of Europe, their economy is poor. And part of the problem is that they have to pay for that war. Because they were blamed for the war, they have to pay for the war. And so their economy is horrible, this economy is good. And so what that means is that because the economy is bad, the temptation for socialism becomes greater. Italy will be the first one, and this will be the mid-1920s. Italy will become what we call fascist, and I'll explain what that means. It's a form of socialism. It's a dictatorship that allows some private property. Okay? By 1933, Germany becomes Nazi, National Socialist. And Hitler, very important, is elected. So what does that mean? He's elected as a socialist. What does that mean about Germany in 1933? If he's elected, what does it mean? It was a democracy, right? But he is elected, and after he's elected, by 1933, by the time we get to 1935 and 36, Hitler has dismantled the democracy. So Germany is now a dictatorship, and remains so until the end of the war. And it's the Nazi Germany that is responsible for starting World War II. So what we have is that there are economic difficulties. So I'm going to make this because this is like a lot of words. Post World War I. Winners and losers. By the way, the United States is totally opposed to this, but we'll talk about that in a second. And the winners have strong economies, and they actually become stronger democracies and very much supportive of rule of law. It's not too hard because England is the one that starts constitutionalism, France follows, all these things. The losers, however, have poor, very poor economies, and as a result, they become dictatorships. They turn to socialism, one way or another, and become dictatorships. But it's a little bit confusing, and I don't want to explain this, but it's kind of a deceptive. They don't call themselves kings, they call themselves dictatorships of the people. So there's a little bit of deception. I'm about a minute over, so I'm going to finish it here. Because of this, 1930s marked by dictators. And Taisha, this is what you get to look up. Who are these dictators? I gave you the names, but who's the dictator of Germany? Who's the dictator of Italy? Who's the dictator of the Soviet Union? And I've given you the names. Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. I want you to look at them. How did this happen? So we have the rise of dictators. This is going to start World War II. And this is where Jordan and Autumn and Amber come in. Why did it start? Why did the U.S. not want to get involved at first? And then lastly, how and why did U.S. finally get involved?
We can handle that reason.
Yes, I think you know. That makes sense? So today was primarily talking about definitions so that when we start to answer these on Wednesday, it'll make a lot more sense. Also on Wednesday, I'll give you back your exams, and then you guys will do your other tasks. Questions, comments, words of wisdom? Okay, no skipping. I'll see you on Wednesday. I will see you next Monday. I will see you next Wednesday. You have 3 more classes. Everyone will be here. We will see you guys on Wednesday.